All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to start our Absolutism and Constitutionalism unit. So during the first half of the unit, we're going to look at absolutism. During the second, we're going to look at constitutionalism, and we're going to look at how these systems of government are different. So today we're going to define absolutism, and then we're going to look at how the 30 Years' War contributed to the rise of this system of government. And then we're going to look at King Louis XIV of France, who is really considered like the archetypal absolute monarch. All right. So first of all, what is an absolute monarchy? So these are strong, centralized states in which the monarchs hold almost all of the power or all of the power, or at least attempt to. Now, one of the many consequences of the 30 Years' War was the rise of absolute monarchies in Western Europe. And how did this happen? Well, what the 30 Years' War did is it popularized the use of standing armies, which are armies that exist even in peacetime. So prior to the 30 Years' War, most governments only organized armies when they needed them. But the 30 Years' War was so devastating that a lot of governments became convinced they needed to have armies protecting them around the clock. Now, the problem is that standing armies are really expensive. So what the government does is it needs to collect more taxes in order to pay for them. So collect more money of what taxes already exist and institute new taxes. Now, collecting taxes, though, also requires a lot of government manpower. So what governments did is they hired more and more bureaucrats and officials who were under the control of the monarch, not the nobles, in order to collect and manage these taxes. Now, what this did is it led to the development of really large, strong governments led by powerful monarchs with a lot of bureaucrats working for them. Now, this wasn't just an effect of the 30 Years' War, though. Remember that this is also the continuation of a trend that started in the Renaissance. So in that unit, we talked about the rise of new monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who centralized their monarchies, grabbed a lot of power for themselves, took power away from the nobles, and then made their states essentially stronger. So we're going to see that trend continue in this unit. All right, so what are the characteristics of absolutist states? Well, in terms of political characteristics, they are, of course, led by an absolute monarch. Now, these absolute monarchs are typically male. We're going to see a variation on absolute monarchy next unit, and one of those monarchs is a woman, but in this unit, they're all dudes. And this monarch carries out policy, as we mentioned, using a really large, well-organized bureaucracy. Now, consider the fact that he's the one who's hiring all these bureaucrats, so they're going to be pretty loyal to him, usually. In terms of economic policy, absolute monarchies are typically mercantilist, so have to remember that from Unit 1. And we'll see the government promote exports and trade, as well as local industry. Now, as we mentioned, right, a really large centralized government requires a lot of money to run. So in a lot of these strong centralized absolute monarchies, we're going to see a lot of taxation, though this tax burden is not going to fall equally on all social classes, as we'll also see. Now, in terms of religious policy, often, though not always, you'll see the monarch control or dominate religion. So in some places, we're going to see a rollback of that religious toleration that we saw emerge at the end of the 30 Years' War. So it's very short-lived in some places, like France. In addition, another really important religious idea in absolute monarchies is the idea of divine right. So these monarchs claimed that their regimes were backed by God. So they had been ordained to rule by God. And what this did is it inspired a lot of loyalty, right? Because if you challenge the monarch, that means that you're challenging God, and that's not a great idea. In terms of cultural characteristics, monarchs used Baroque art and architecture to glorify themselves, just like the Catholic Church did during the Counter-Reformation. Monarchs also really strongly controlled the press and speech, so they did things like issue policies that censored speech that was unfriendly towards them. And then in terms of social characteristics, finally, the monarch really strongly controls the nobility. So they weren't really threatened by the peasants, for the most part. Sometimes they were, but they were very threatened by the nobles. So we'll see a lot of absolute monarchs use sort of a mix of punishments and reward to keep the nobles under their control. All right. So now we're going to turn our attention to France, which again is sort of like the big example of an absolute state during this time period. Now, the foundation is actually going to be set during the mid-1600s, so sort of during the 30 Years' War and then a little bit afterwards. And the people who help establish these absolute monarchies are actually not monarchs themselves. So in France, it's two chief ministers, so government officials, who lay the foundation for absolute monarchy in France. And the first of these is Cardinal Richelieu. Now, Cardinal's his title, it's not his first name. So he's a cardinal, which is a member of the Catholic Church, but France has a lot of control over the church in France already. So as a cardinal, Mazarin or Richelieu, excuse me, Richelieu is not sort of loyal to Rome or to the Catholic Church so much as he is loyal to the government of France. And Cardinal Richelieu, as we mentioned, he's the chief minister of Louis XIII, and he's the real power behind the throne. Now, what he did is he really laid the foundation by controlling the nobility. So he was especially controlling of the Huguenot or Protestant nobility, right? And again, he was kind of a mix of punishment and reward. So he granted them actually religious rights, but he took away a lot of their political power and gave it to himself and to the king. He also expanded the size of the bureaucracy and increased the taille, which is the French land tax. So raising taxes, hiring more officials, ensuring he has this loyal base of power, who aren't nobles. Now, he's succeeded by Cardinal Mazarin, again, another cardinal, but again, like Richelieu, he is loyal to the state of France. He is not loyal as much to the Catholic Church. And he serves as chief minister while King Louis XIV, who's going to go on to become an absolute monarch, was a child. So he was really Louis XIV's like mentor figure. They were really close. And Cardinal Mazarin actually took Richelieu's policies, especially with the nobles, one step further, or actually a lot of steps further. And what he did is when Louis XIV was, I think he was actually a teenager, there was an uprising of the nobles against the monarchy because they were mad they were losing a lot of their power, right? And what Cardinal Mazarin did is he violently crushed this revolt. So you can imagine how that lays the foundation for absolute monarchy. It's taking a lot of power away from the nobles. And you can see how King Louis XIV, as a young man, is looking at that and realizing, A, the nobles are a threat to his power, and B, that he better kick their butts if he wants to stay in power, right? So Cardinal Mazarin actually dies when King Louis XIV comes of age, and he's going to continue those policies and take them in a new direction. All right, so just to give you a sense of who we're talking about here, there's Richelieu on the left and Mazarin on the right. So you can see pointy beards, very in style right now. All right, so King Louis XIV, he is really the big daddy of absolutism. And he was really image conscious. So he took a lot of pains to promote himself as an absolute monarch. And one of the ways he did that is he nicknamed himself the Sun King, right? So when you're comparing yourself to the sun, what are you saying about your power, right? And one of the first things that he does, because again, he's learned from that revolt of the nobles, so the Fronde, he learned from Cardinal Mazarin's example, he knows that step one is he needs to bring those nobles under his control and show them who's boss, right? So what he does is he just picks up all the nobles and he moves them to this palace that his family has called Versailles, which is outside of Paris. So like today, it takes you about an hour to get there from Paris. I'm not sure how much time it took you back then. And this move helps Louis in a variety of ways. So first of all, he rebuilds Versailles. So it is fancy. So it's in the Baroque style. It's also a little bit of another style we'll talk about a little bit later. And the whole point of this was it was intended to awe the nobles into submission. I'll show you some pictures in a second. So again, this is a lot like the Catholic Church using Baroque art to glorify themselves and establish their power during the Counter-Reformation. So really similar motivations here in use of art. And moreover, moving all those nobles outside of Paris allows Louis to keep them close and under his control. So if you've ever had that experience maybe where you're in a classroom and you're talking with your friends and the teacher comes over and just kind of stands there next to you, what's the point of that, right? Well, the teacher's trying to tell you to shut up, right? And so Louis kind of takes that approach. He just moves the nobles closer to them. And he's like, all right, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to watch you. I'm going to babysit you to make sure you don't revolt against me, right? And in addition to that, he didn't just sort of like let them wander around Versailles not doing anything. He also established like this system of ritual and sort of like he had all these parties and all of like these strange court practices that kept the nobles really, really busy. So they wouldn't even have time to think about revolting against him. So one really famous ritual is he had this whole ritual for waking up. So he'd have all the nobles come into his bedroom and basically like applaud him. He'd have someone like put on his shirt, and like these were all really prestigious positions. So he really tried to, he was almost like a celebrity, right? And this is his entourage. So he tried to make the nobles into his little hangers on, and it actually worked pretty well. All right. So just as an example of, well, I'll show you Versailles. And then also, as I mentioned, right, Louis is really using Baroque art and architecture to glorify himself. So there on the far left end is a bust of him by Bernini, who we also saw. We also saw his work last unit. There in the middle is the Hall of Mirrors, which is one of the rooms at Versailles. So you can see just gold everywhere, chandeliers, giant mirrors, right? Like if you ever go here, it's fun, like it is fantastic. Like you are overwhelmed by just how tacky, honestly, everything is. And this language or like this sort of style of art, like it continues to convey power. It continues to be part of the language of power. So just as an example of that, right, over on the far right is Mar-a-Lago, which is one of Trump's resorts. So again, you can see it kind of looks like Versailles, right? So again, the intent is to sort of convey, like, if you stay here, you are powerful, you are special, you are like the Sun King, right? All right, let's talk about Louis and religion. So I mentioned, right, that some of those absolute states are going to roll back those protections established by the Peace of Westphalia, and Louis is going to actually go even further. And so what he does is he knows, again, that the Protestants are, so he's Catholic, right? The Protestants are a big threat to him. He's worried about, he thinks they are, he's worried about them, right? So what he does is he actually not only ignores the Peace of Westphalia and doesn't allow them to practice, he goes back even further and he revokes the Edict of Nantes, right? Which was that policy, right, that established Catholicism as the official religion of France, but allowed Protestants to practice freely, right? And this edict, where he revoked the Edict of Nantes, is called the Edict of Fontainebleau. So remember that name; it's going to come up. So just remember it as it revokes the Edict of Nantes. It prohibits Protestants from practicing their religion. Now remember, right? There's still a relationship, sort of, between religion and politics, right? So remember that in France, a lot of nobles are Calvinists, right? They're Huguenots. And so controlling religion for Louis also gives him more control over the nobles, which we know he really loves, right? Now, finally, let's talk about his economic policy. So the name you need to know here is Colbert. That's Louis's finance minister, who is really the architect of a lot of his policy. And he pursued a mercantilist economic policy. So he was really interested in boosting France's export, building infrastructure, so like roads and bridges in France, and in helping a French manufacturing industry develop. And this is actually pretty successful. But there's a problem. So Louis, on the other hand, right, what he does is he raises taxes, right? But the reason why he does that is because he's really into spending money, right? You can imagine Versailles, like getting it to look like that was super expensive. Louis was also really into war, and we'll find out a little bit next unit, actually, all the wars that he got himself into, and that was also really expensive. So on the one hand, like Colbert is actually pursuing this relatively successful policy of building manufacturing. That's making France a lot of money. Louis is taking in money through taxes, but he's also spending a lot of money at the same time, right? So this ends up putting France in debt. And moreover, when Louis raises taxes, that tax burden doesn't fall equally to all people in society. So he actually limits some of the taxes on nobles, again, to sort of like use it as a carrot to keep them in line. But he taxes the peasants really heavily, which is not great, as you can imagine, because peasants, first of all, well, they don't have a lot of money to give up. It's trying to squeeze blood from a stone there. And moreover, the peasants are not happy about this. So what Louis does is he establishes this really strong absolute monarchy, but it's really going to only last as long as he's around. When he dies, he actually leaves France in a really bad position.